An elderly man decided it was time for a change, so he packed his belongings and moved into a retirement home. On his first day, as he was unpacking in his new room, he noticed a woman across the hall staring at him intently. Finding it a little odd, he decided to brush it off. Later that evening, he went to the cafeteria for dinner. As he sat down to eat, he saw the same woman seated at a nearby table, still staring without even a plate of food in front of her. Feeling slightly unnerved but choosing to ignore it, he focused on his meal. After dinner, he headed to the lounge to play the nightly bingo game. Just as he was starting to enjoy himself, he noticed her again, sitting quietly, her eyes fixed on him like before. Finally, he'd had enough. He walked up to her and said, "Ma'am, I couldn't help but notice you've been staring at me ever since I arrived. Could you please stop? It's a bit unsettling." The woman smiled apologetically and said, "I'm sorry. It's just that you look so much like my third husband." Feeling a little guilty for snapping, the man softened. "Oh, I see. If you don't mind me asking, how many husbands have you had?" With a sly grin, she replied, "2." One night, a man stumbled into the police station with a black eye. He told the officer on duty, "I heard a noise in my backyard, so I went to check it out. The next thing I knew, something hit me in the eye, and I was knocked out cold." The officer decided to investigate and headed to the man's house. About an hour and a half later, he returned to the station with a black eye of his own. The captain looked at him and asked, "Did you get hit by the same person?" "No," the officer replied with a sigh. "I stepped on the same rake." One hot day, an old scraggly cat wandered to our door. She was a pitiful sight. Starving, dirty, matted fur, and smelling awful. We felt sorry for her, so we put her in a carrier and took her to the vet. Since she had no name, we decided to call her Pussy. The vet said he'd keep her for a day or so to clean her up and run some tests. As we were leaving, my husband, who's always been a bit of a complainer, said, "Fine, but don't forget to wash her. She stinks." Now, my husband and the vet don't exactly get along. The vet calls him El Cheapo, and my husband calls him El Taco. They both seem to enjoy their ongoing rivalry. The next day, my husband had a doctor's appointment next door to the vet's office. The waiting room was packed with patients when suddenly the side door opened and in leaned the vet. He had obviously noticed my husband walk in. In a loud, clear voice, he said, "Your wife's pussy is finally clean. Smells like a rose now. Oh, and by the way, I think she's pregnant. God knows who the father is." Then, without another word, he closed the door. Ever since I was a kid, I've been terrified there's someone hiding under my bed at night. Finally, I went to see a psychiatrist and told him about my problem. Every night, I lie awake, scared someone's under the bed. I think I'm losing my mind. The psychiatrist nodded and said, "I can help. Come see me 3 times a week for a year and we'll work through it." "How much do you charge?" I asked. $80 per visit, he replied. I told him I'd think about it. 6 months later, the psychiatrist ran into me on the street. "Why didn't you come back to see me about your fears?" he asked. "Well," I said, $80 a visit 3 times a week for a year? That's a lot of money. A bartender cured me for just $10. I was so happy I saved all that cash, I bought a new SUV. "A bartender?" the psychiatrist scoffed. "And how did a bartender cure you? He told me to cut the legs off my bed. Ain't nobody under there now." The king decided to go fishing and asked the royal meteorologist for the weather forecast. The forecaster confidently assured him, "No chance of rain, Your Majesty." Trusting this advice, the king and queen set off for their fishing trip. On the way, they encountered a fisherman riding a donkey. The king stopped to ask, "Are the fish biting today?" The fisherman replied, "Your Majesty, I'd advise you to return to the palace. A heavy rainstorm is coming soon." The king laughed. "Nonsense! I trust my palace meteorologist. He's an educated professional, and I pay him handsomely. Besides, he said it wouldn't rain." Ignoring the fisherman, the king continued his trip. Not long after, the skies opened, and a torrential downpour drenched the royal couple. Furious and soaking wet, the king stormed back to the palace and fired the meteorologist. Then he summoned the fisherman. "Clearly, you have better forecasting skills. I want you to be the new royal meteorologist." The fisherman protested. Your Majesty, I don't know anything about weather forecasting. I simply watch my donkey. When its ears droop, I know it's going to rain. Impressed by the simplicity, the king hired the donkey instead. And that, dear friends, is how the practice of hiring dumbasses for influential positions in government began and continues to this day. Two little boys, ages 8 and 10, were notoriously mischievous. If something went wrong in their town, their parents knew it was likely their doing. Desperate for help, their mother heard about a preacher who was reputed to have a knack for disciplining kids. She asked if he could talk to her sons. The preacher agreed, but insisted on seeing them one at a time. The younger boy went first. That morning, the preacher, a towering man with a booming voice, sat him down and asked sternly, "Do you know where God is, son?" The boy's eyes widened and his mouth dropped open, but he didn't respond. The preacher leaned in closer and repeated even louder, "Where is God?" The boy still didn't answer, frozen in his seat. Finally, the preacher raised his voice to a thunderous level, pointing his finger for emphasis. "Where is God?" Terrified, the boy jumped out of his seat, bolted from the room, ran all the way home, and dove into his closet, slamming the door behind him. His older brother found him there, huddled and shaking. "What happened?" he asked. Gasping for breath, the younger boy replied, "We're in big trouble this time. God is missing, and they think we did it." A couple in Sweetwater, Texas, had a large collection of potted plants. During a recent cold snap, the wife decided to bring them indoors to protect them from the freeze. Unbeknownst to her, a little green garden snake had hidden in one of the pots. After warming up inside the house, the snake slithered out, and she spotted it sliding under the sofa. She let out a blood-curdling scream. Her husband, who was in the shower, ran into the living room dripping wet to find out what was wrong. She frantically told him about the snake under the sofa. Bravely, he got down on his hands and knees to investigate. Just as he leaned in, the family dog came up behind him and gave him a cold nose to the rear. Thinking the snake had bitten him, he screamed, jumped, and collapsed on the floor. His wife panicked, thinking he'd had a heart attack. She covered him with a blanket, told him to lie still, and called 911. When the paramedics arrived, they ignored the husband's protests and loaded him onto a stretcher. As they carried him out, the snake slithered out from under the sofa. One of the EMTs saw it, freaked out, and dropped his end of the stretcher. The husband tumbled to the floor, breaking his leg. Now at the hospital with a broken leg, the wife was still left with the snake problem. She called a neighbor, who arrived armed with a rolled-up newspaper. After poking around for a while, he declared the snake gone. Relieved, the wife sat down on the sofa to catch her breath. But as her hand slipped between the cushions, she felt something wriggle. Realizing it was the snake, she screamed and fainted. The neighbor, seeing her unconscious, rushed over and began performing CPR. At that moment, his wife walked in, fresh from grocery shopping. Misunderstanding the situation, she swung her bag of canned goods at his head, knocking him out cold and splitting his scalp. Hearing the commotion, the wife woke up, saw the neighbor on the floor with his wife bending over him, and assumed the snake had bitten him too. She rushed to the kitchen, grabbed a bottle of whiskey, and started pouring it down his throat. The police arrived next, saw the unconscious neighbor, smelled the whiskey, and concluded there had been a drunken brawl. As they tried to sort it out, the snake slithered out again. One of the officers panicked and fired his gun, missing the snake but hitting an end table. The table toppled over, shattering a lamp. The broken bulb ignited the drapes, starting a small fire. The other officer tried to extinguish the flames, but fell through the window, landing on the family dog. The startled dog bolted into the street, causing an oncoming car to swerve and crash into the police cruiser. Meanwhile, neighbors called the fire department. As the fire truck arrived, its ladder snagged overhead wires, knocking out power and phones for 10 city blocks. Eventually, the fire was put out, the husband's leg healed, the neighbor got stitches, the police got a new car, and life returned to normal. One night, while watching TV, the weatherman announced another cold snap. The wife turned to her husband and asked, "Should we bring the plants in tonight?" That's when he shot her. A young blonde pilot is taking her first flying lesson in a two-seater plane. Suddenly, her instructor has a heart attack and slumps over, lifeless. Panicking, she grabs the radio and screams, "Mayday, Mayday, help me! My instructor is dead and I don't know how to fly!" A calm voice responds over the radio. "This is air traffic control. I hear you loud and clear. Stay calm. I've handled situations like this before. I'll talk you through it and help you land safely. First, take a deep breath. Now tell me your height and position." The blonde replies, "I am 5'7", and sitting in the front seat." After a long pause, the voice on the radio sighs, "Okay. Now repeat after me. Our Father, who art in heaven." Husband's message. "Sweetheart, I was hit by a car outside the office. Tina brought me to the hospital. They've done tests and x-rays. The blow to my head is pretty bad, but thankfully, no lasting injuries. I have 3 broken ribs, a fractured arm, a compound fracture in my left leg, and they might have to amputate my right foot." Wife's response, "Who's Tina?" A priest and a nun are caught in a blizzard. They find a deserted cabin with a bed, a sleeping bag, and a pile of blankets. Being a gentleman, the priest offers the bed to the nun and takes the sleeping bag for himself. As they settle in for the night, the nun calls out, "Father, I'm cold." The priest gets up, adds a blanket, and asks, "Is that better, sister?" "Oh, yes, much better, thank you," she replies. But a short while later, she calls again, "Father, I'm still cold." The priest gets up, adds another blanket, and tucks her in tightly. "Is that better, sister?" "Yes, Father, much better," she says. Just as he's dozing off, he hears her again. "Father, I'm still so cold." This time, the priest pauses, thinks it over, and says, "Sister, we're in the middle of nowhere, caught in a blizzard. No one but us and the Lord will ever know what happens here tonight. How about just for tonight we act as if we're married?" The nun hesitates, then replies, "Okay, Father, just for tonight we'll act as if we're married." The priest immediately snaps, "Then get up and get your own damn blanket." And with that, he rolls over and goes to sleep. Dead penguins. Did you ever wonder? Have you ever wondered why there are no dead penguins on the ice in Antarctica? Where do they go? Wonder no more. It's a well-known fact that penguins are extremely ritualistic birds, living an incredibly ordered and complex life. They are committed to their families, mate for life, and maintain close, compassionate contact with their offspring throughout their lives. If a penguin is found dead on the ice, other members of the family and social circle have been known to dig holes in the ice, using their wings and beaks until the hole is deep enough to roll the dead bird into and bury it. Then the male penguins gather around the fresh grave and sing, "Freeze a jolly good fellow, freeze a jolly good fellow." Did you really think I knew anything about penguins? 4 guys were at deer camp and they had to bunk 2 to a room. No one wanted to room with Daryl because he snored so loudly. They decided it wasn't fair to make just one person stay with him the whole time, so they voted to take turns. The first guy slept with Daryl, and by morning, he came to breakfast with his hair a mess and his eyes bloodshot. The other 2 asked, "What happened to you?" He replied, "Daryl snored so loudly I couldn't sleep. I just sat up and watched him all night." The next night, it was the second guy's turn. By morning, the same thing happened again, hair standing up, eyes bloodshot. The others asked, "Man, what happened to you?" He said, "That Daryl shakes the whole room. I sat up and watched him all night." The third night, it was Frank's turn. Frank was a big, burly ex-football player, a real man's man. The next morning, he came to breakfast looking bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. The others couldn't believe it. "What happened to you?" they asked. Frank grinned and said, "Well, we got ready for bed. I tucked Daryl in, patted his butt, and kissed him goodnight. Daryl sat up and watched me all night." On the first day of college, the dean addressed the students, outlining some of the rules. The female dormitory will be off-limits to male students, and the male dormitory will be off-limits to female students. Anyone caught breaking this rule will be fined $20 the first time. He continued, "If you're caught again, the fine will be $60. A third violation will cost you $180. The room was silent for a moment, and then a male student raised his hand and asked, How much for a season pass? A blonde man and a brunette woman were happily married and expecting their first child. One day, the wife began having contractions, so the husband rushed her to the hospital. He held her hand through the tough labor, and eventually, 2 baby boys were born. The blonde man turned to his wife, glaring, and said, "All right, who's the other father?" A man takes the day off work and decides to go golfing. While on the second hole, he notices a frog sitting next to the green. He thinks nothing of it, but as he's about to take his shot, he hears, "Ribbit, 9-iron." The man looks around, confused, but doesn't see anyone. The frog repeats, "Ribbit, 9-iron." Thinking the frog is just being quirky, he grabs his 9-iron and boom! He hits it just 10 inches from the cup. Shocked, he turns to the frog and says, "Wow, you're one lucky frog." The frog responds, "Ribbit, lucky frog." Impressed, the man decides to take the frog along for the next hole. "What should I use here?" he asked the frog. "Ribbit, 3 wood," says the frog. The man uses the 3 wood and, boom, a hole in 1. By the end of the round, the man has played the best game of golf in his life. He turns to the frog and asks, "Okay, where to next?" The frog replies, "Ribbit, Las Vegas." In Vegas, the man follows the frog's advice again. "Ribbit, roulette." At the roulette table, the man asks, "What should I bet?" The frog says, "Ribbit, $3,000, black 6. Though it's a long shot, the man decides to go for it. He places the bet. Boom! He wins big. With his winnings, the man buys the best room in the hotel. He sits the frog down and says, "I don't know how to repay you. You've won me so much money, I'm forever grateful." The frog replies, "Ribbit, kiss me." The man, feeling generous, kisses the frog. Suddenly, the frog turns into a beautiful 15-year-old girl. The man, stunned, says, "And that, Your Honor, is how the girl ended up in my room." Wife, "Honey, I need to get a bra." The husband sighed and said, "Leave it alone. The ones you have are so small to have a bra." The wife playfully replied, "Oh, really? Well, yesterday when you picked out new underwear for yourself, did I say anything to you?" Why women really need to go to the restroom together. You enter a public restroom and there's a line. You smile politely and take your place. Finally, a stall opens and you rush in, almost knocking into the woman exiting. Of course, the door won't latch, but you've waited so long you're about to burst. You spot the modern seat covers dispenser, empty. No hooks on the door for your purse, so you drape it around your neck. You're about to do the stance when your thighs start to tremble. You'd love to sit, but who knows what germs lurk on that toilet seat. You reach for the toilet paper dispenser, empty. Suddenly, your mother's voice echoes in your mind. If you had wiped the seat first, you would have seen there was no paper. Then, you remember the tiny tissue you used yesterday, still in your purse, dangling around your neck. It's not much, but you crumple it up. Just as you do, the door swings open because the latch doesn't work. It knocks into your purse, which swings you backwards into the toilet tank. "Occupied!" you shout. But in your panic, you drop the tissue and lose your balance, sliding right onto the wet toilet seat. You know your mom would be horrified. You never touch a public toilet seat, right? Just when you think it couldn't get worse, the automatic toilet flushes with the force of a fire hose, spraying water everywhere, including on you. You're soaked and exhausted, clinging to the empty toilet paper holder for dear life. You slink out of the stall, hands wet, barely managing to wipe them with spit and a dry paper towel. You walk past the line of women, now unable to smile politely. One woman points out a piece of toilet paper stuck to your shoe. Where was that when you needed it? You yank it off, hand it to her, and say, "Here, you might need this." And as you exit, your husband, who has long since used the men's restroom, asks, "What took you so long, and why is your purse hanging around your neck?" There it is, ladies. This is why we need to go to the restroom together. It's not just for company. Someone has to hold the door, keep track of your purse, and hand you that precious tissue under the door. 3 women work in the same office with the same female boss. Every day they notice the boss leaves work early. One day, the women decide that when the boss leaves, they'll follow suit. After all, she never calls or comes back, so how would she know? The brunette is thrilled to be home early, tending to her garden and going to bed early. The redhead is excited to get in a quick workout at her spa before meeting a dinner date. The blonde is happy to be home, but when she gets to her bedroom, she hears muffled noises from inside. Quietly, she cracks open the door and is mortified to see her husband in bed with her boss. Ever so gently, she closes the door and tiptoes out of the house. The next day, during coffee break, the brunette and redhead excitedly talk about leaving early again and ask the blonde if she's joining them. "No way!" she exclaims. "I almost got caught yesterday." Three little boys were wondering why no one would play with them. They decided it was because they hadn't been baptized and didn't attend Sunday school, so they went to the nearest church. The janitor was the only one there. "We need to be baptized," one of the boys said. "No one will play with us. Can you baptize us?" "Sure," said the janitor. He took them into the bathroom and dunked their heads in the toilet bowl, one at a time. "Now go out and play." As they stepped outside, dripping wet, one boy asked, "What religion do you think we are?" The oldest one said, "We're not Catholic because they pour water on you. We're not Baptist because they dunk all of you. We're not Methodist because they just sprinkle you." The littlest one sniffed the air and said, "Did you smell that water?" "Yes, what do you think that means?" "That means we're Episcopalians." Three old ladies, Gertrude, Maud, and Tilly, were sitting on a park bench having a quiet conversation. Suddenly, a handsome young man dressed only in a trench coat approached them from across the park. He was holding the coat together with his hands and didn't seem to be wearing anything underneath. The young man came up to the ladies, stood right in front of them, and opened his trench coat with one swift motion. Gertrude immediately had a stroke. Seeing her friend's reaction, Maud also had a stroke, but Tilly, bless her heart, being older and more feeble than her friends, couldn't quite reach that far. A farmer had 5 female pigs. Times were tough, so he decided to take them to the county fair and sell them. At the fair, he met another farmer who owned 5 male pigs. After talking a bit, they agreed to mate the pigs and split everything 50-50ths. The farmers lived 60 miles apart, so they decided to drive 30 miles each, meet in a field, and let the pigs mate. The next morning, the farmer with the female pigs woke up at 5 a.m., loaded the pigs into his station wagon, the only vehicle he had, and drove the 30 miles. While the pigs were mating, he asked the other farmer, "How will I know if they're pregnant?" The other farmer replied, "If they're lying in the grass tomorrow morning, they're pregnant. If they're in the mud, they're not." The next morning, the pigs were in the mud, so the farmer hosed them off, loaded them back into the station wagon, and drove back for another round. This went on for over a week, and both farmers were worn out. One morning, too tired to get out of bed, the farmer called to his wife, "Honey, please look outside and tell me if the pigs are in the grass or in the mud." "Neither," yelled his wife. "They're in the station wagon and one of them is honking the horn." A couple has a dog that snores loudly, keeping the wife awake at night. Annoyed, she goes to the vet to ask for advice. The vet tells her, "Tie a ribbon around the dog's testicles and he'll stop snoring." "Yeah, right," she says, skeptical but willing to try anything. That night, as usual, the dog starts snoring loudly. Unable to sleep, the wife grabs a ribbon, ties it around the dog's testicles, and, to her amazement, the dog immediately stops snoring. The next morning, the husband wakes up with a terrible hangover. As he stumbles into the bathroom, he looks in the mirror and sees a blue ribbon tied around his privates. He's completely confused. Walking back into the bedroom, he notices a red ribbon on the dog's testicles. He stares at the dog, then back at himself and mutters, "I don't know where we were or what we did, but we sure got first and second place." A fairy godmother decides to grant 3 wishes to a little old lady. "What would you like for your first wish?" the fairy godmother asks. The little old lady says, "I would like to be rich." Poof! Her rocking chair turns into solid gold. "And for your second wish?" asks the fairy godmother. The little old lady says, "I would like to be young again." Poof! The little old lady transforms into a beautiful young woman. "And for your third and final wish?" asks the fairy godmother. The young woman's cat, Bert, jumps into her lap. She asks the fairy godmother, "Can you turn Bert into a handsome young prince?" Poof! Suddenly, Bert is a handsome young prince. The handsome young prince leans down to the young woman and whispers softly in her ear, "Don't you wish you hadn't had me neutered?" Jack wakes up with a massive hangover after attending his company's Christmas party. He's not usually a drinker, but the drinks at the party didn't taste like alcohol at all. He doesn't even remember how he got home. As bad as he feels, he wonders if he did something wrong. He forces his eyes open, and the first thing he sees is a couple of aspirin next to a glass of water on the side table, along with a single red rose. Jack sits up and notices his clothes neatly laid out in front of him, freshly pressed. He looks around the room. It's spotless, as is the rest of the house. He takes the aspirin, cringes at the huge black eye in the bathroom mirror, then notices a note hanging from the corner of the mirror, written in red with little hearts and a lipstick kiss from his wife. "Honey, breakfast is on the stove. I left early to get groceries for your favorite dinner tonight. I love you, darling. Love, Jillian." Jack stumbles into the kitchen, and sure enough, there's a hot breakfast, steaming coffee, and the morning newspaper all waiting for him. His son is sitting at the table eating. Jack asks, "Son, what happened last night?" "Well, you came home after 3 a.m., drunk and out of your mind. You tripped over the coffee table, broke it, then puked in the hallway, and got that black eye when you ran into the door." Confused, Jack asks, "So why is everything so perfectly clean? And why is there a rose with breakfast waiting for me?" His son replies, "Oh, that! Well, Mom dragged you to the bedroom, and when she tried to take your pants off, you screamed, 'Leave me alone, I'm married!'" Grandma and Grandpa were visiting their kids overnight. While rummaging through the medicine cabinet, Grandpa found a bottle of Viagra. Curious, he asked his son about using one of the pills. The son said, "I don't think you should, Dad. They're very strong and very expensive." "How much?" asked Grandpa. $10 a pill," the son replied. "I don't care," said Grandpa. "I'd still like to try one. I'll leave the money under the pillow when we leave in the morning." The next morning, the son found $110 under the pillow. Confused, he called Grandpa and said, "I told you each pill was $10, not $110. "I know," Grandpa replied. "The $100 is from Grandma." An attorney arrived home late after a tough day trying to get a stay of execution for his client. His last-minute plea for clemency to the governor had failed, and he was feeling exhausted and defeated. As soon as he stepped through the door, his wife started in on him. "What time do you call this? Where have you been? Dinner's cold, and I'm not reheating it." And on she went, complaining about everything, too worn out to engage in the usual back and forth. He poured himself a shot of whiskey and made his way to the bathtub for a long, soothing soak, all while his wife's sarcastic remarks followed him up the stairs. While he was relaxing in the bath, the phone rang. His wife answered and was told that her husband's client, James Wright, had been granted a stay of execution after all. He would not be hanged that night. Realizing how terrible the day must have been for him, she decided to go upstairs and share the good news. As she opened the bathroom door, she found him bent over, naked, drying his legs and feet. She cheerfully announced, "They're not hanging Wright tonight." He whirled around, panic in his eyes, and screamed, "For the love of God, woman, don't you ever stop!" A man in a suit approaches a house, juggling a clipboard, papers, and a briefcase. He knocks, and a middle-aged man answers. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "Good morning, sir. I represent Schneller, Barnum, and Holtz. We're hired by companies to survey consumers about their products. Today, we're gathering feedback on Vaseline petroleum jelly. Do you have a moment to answer a couple of questions?" "Sure, I've got time. Go ahead." The surveyor glances at his clipboard and asks, "First question, do you use Vaseline?" "Yes, been using it for years." "Great, and what do you use it for?" "Well, for dry skin, chapped lips, and other things." The surveyor pauses, raises an eyebrow, and asks, "Other things, could you elaborate on that?" The man leans in and whispers, "We use it on the bedroom doorknob." The surveyor steps back, puzzled. "The doorknob? How does that work?" The homeowner grins and says, "It keeps the kids out." One morning, a lion wakes up feeling particularly fierce and confrontational. He spots a small monkey and corners it, roaring, "Who is the mightiest of all the jungle animals?" The trembling monkey stammers, "You are, mighty lion." Feeling emboldened, the lion marches over to an ox and bellows, "Who is the mightiest of all the jungle animals?" The frightened ox quickly replies, "Oh, great lion, you are the mightiest." On a roll, the lion struts up to an elephant and roars, "Who is the mightiest of all jungle animals?" In a flash, the elephant grabs the lion with his trunk, slams him against a tree several times, and stomps on him until the lion looks like a flattened tortilla. The elephant then casually walks away. Weakly, the lion lifts his head, groaning in pain, and yells after the elephant, "Just because you didn't know the answer doesn't mean you had to get so upset."